They called him a monster before anyone bothered to ask who he had refused to become. Ethan Cole stood beneath the cold white beams of the tribunal chamber with restraint cuffs locked around his wrists and the taste of recycled air sitting flat on his tongue like old pennies. The room smelled of ozone, polished stone, and the faint medicinal bite of antiseptic, as if even judgment here had to be sterilized before it touched the living. Above him, the vaulted ceiling glimmered with blue glass veins that carried light like frozen lightning, and beyond the curved walls, 100 alien faces watched in disciplined silence. Some were hard with grief. Some were curious. Most looked at him the way frontier towns looked at brushfire on a dry day, something dangerous, something hungry, something that could spread. Ethan kept his shoulders level anyway. His dress shirt, once charcoal gray, was still marked by dust from the field and a thin line of dried sealant along one cuff where he had patched torn medwrap in the dark. He could feel every hour he had not slept sitting behind his eyes. He could also feel the weight of the room pressing down on one ugly truth: to them, he was not Ethan Cole, former Terran combat medic, age 34, born in Nebraska, 6'1", tired to the bone. He was human. And human, in this chamber, meant the thing mothers warned their children about when the skies lit up. A voice rang from the elevated bench, smooth and amplified without effort. Ethan Cole of Earth, you stand before the Concord Tribunal on charges of unlawful engagement, breach of military protocol, interference with battlefield command, and the deaths of Allied personnel during a combat withdrawal. The translator at his collar rendered the alien cadence into clean American English, but it could not soften the temperature of the words. Across the chamber, a panel of judges sat in a crescent of silver desks, their robes dark as deep water. The central judge had skin the color of sea glass and eyes like polished brass. He did not look cruel. He looked precise. Ethan had learned long ago that precision could be colder than anger. To the judge's left, a prosecutor rose. Her uniform caught the light in sharp edges, all navy plating and pale gold trim, and when she turned toward Ethan, her expression carried the absolute confidence of someone who had already told herself the story and had no need for new facts. This human, she said, was witnessed at 3 separate fronts. Armed. Advancing. Defiant under surrender warnings. He is a product of a species famed across sectors for escalation, for relentless force, for answering fear with greater fear. A murmur moved through the gallery, low and restless, like wind passing over frozen reeds. Ethan did not flinch. He had heard versions of that speech before, in barracks, in negotiations, in the hollow pauses after sirens. He knew what humans looked like from the outside. A little too fast. A little too loud. Too willing to run toward smoke if someone else was still inside it. The prosecutor lifted one hand toward him. They fear human violence because experience has taught them to. Then she turned toward the witness platform, and for the first time since being brought into the chamber, Ethan raised his eyes. Commander Saren Vale stood there in a fitted slate uniform, her blue-green skin luminous beneath the tribunal lights, her posture held with military stillness despite the pale healing line at her temple. She did not look at the judges first. She looked at him. Just once. Long enough for Ethan to see that the old suspicion in her face had changed into something heavier and harder to name. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to stop the room. That, she said, is only the first half of what experience taught us. Saren Vale did not raise her voice, but the chamber seemed to lean toward her anyway. Her hands rested at the edge of the witness rail, long fingers still except for the slightest tap of one thumb against the polished metal, as if she were measuring each word before allowing it into the air. Yes, she said, her translator carrying the clean, low cadence across the tribunal, humans can be terrifying in war. I believed that long before I met this one. I was raised on evacuation sirens, crater maps, and casualty reports stamped with Terran serial codes. I knew the sound of human engines before I was old enough to wear command colors. So when I found him on the field, I did not see a man. I saw the shape of every warning I had ever been given. The prosecutor folded Her hands behind her back. Then your testimony confirms our position. No, Saren said, and for the first time there was iron under the calm. It confirms only your beginning. A hush settled over the gallery. Ethan kept his eyes on her, though the restraint cuffs had begun to bite at the bones of his wrists. He remembered that tone. He had heard it once through static and failing battery power, half buried under dust and stormlight, when she had still believed he was either a fool or a threat. The prosecutor turned one fraction toward the judges. Commander Vale, remain within verifiable facts. Saren did not even glance at her. Fact. At 1900 local time, Sector Kestrel 9 had already collapsed into crossfire and atmospheric interference. Fact. My unit was separated during a retreat order corrupted by storm distortion. Fact. I was pinned beneath structural debris with a damaged transmitter, a failing field dressing, and no expectation of recovery. She let the word settle, then looked directly at Ethan again. Fact. The first human to reach me was fully armed, physically capable of leaving, and under no obligation to stop. Ethan felt the old memory rise with the clarity of cold water. The field had smelled like heated stone and ruptured coolant. His display had been cracked at the corner, battery reserve blinking at 11%, and every step through the red dust had sounded too loud inside his own helmet. He had been moving toward a ridge line that might have offered signal, or shelter, or at least a place to stop feeling like the sky itself was pressing downward. Then a flicker on the motion scanner. A heat signature where there should have been none. He should have kept walking. Even now, standing beneath tribunal lights that turned every scar into public property, Ethan knew that. The practical choice had been obvious. He was alone, low on medgel, low on water, and more than a mile from his last known extraction point. Yet practical choices had never been the whole engine behind him. Not after the years in field hospitals. Not after the civilians he had carried. Not after learning that the difference between a body and a person was often just whether someone stopped long enough to ask one question. Saren's next words landed softly, but they changed the temperature of the room. He did not ask my rank. He did not demand codes. He did not search for intelligence. He looked at the wreckage trapping my leg, checked whether I could breathe, and set his rifle down in the dirt before he ever touched me. Somewhere in the gallery, someone let out a slow, unsteady breath. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. A calculated display of trust can be manipulation. Perhaps, Saren replied. But not when the storm was 6 minutes out, his suit reserve was almost gone, and leaving me there would have improved his odds. She straightened, the tribunal light catching the faint silver at the edge of her healed temple. You wish to know when my understanding of humans changed. It did not begin when he saved lives. It began when he gave up the advantage of being feared. The memory came back to Ethan with the sharp clarity of frost on glass. Sector Kestrel 9 had been all red dust, broken antenna masts, and long ribbons of static skimming low across the ground like the planet itself was trying to whisper warnings no one could quite translate. His boots sank half an inch into powder that had once been stone before heat and pressure changed it into something finer, stranger, almost metallic on the air filters. Every step sent a dull ache through his left knee where a brace under the suit had started to slip, and the cracked corner of his visor kept flashing the same ugly truth in amber letters, battery reserve 11%. He could smell scorched polymer inside the helmet seal, along with the faint medicinal sting of dried antiseptic from a patch on his forearm. Nothing around him felt alive except the wind and the failing system strapped to his body. Then his motion scanner gave one weak pulse. Ethan stopped so fast the med pack on his back shifted hard against his shoulders. Another pulse. Not moving much. Low heat, inconsistent. Could have been debris holding warmth. Could have been a trap. Could have been someone still breathing. He stood there for a second that felt a little too long, listening to the thin hiss of his own ventilation and the distant groan of weather building over the ridge. Extraction was somewhere to the west if the NAV chip had not gone stupid with the storm field. Shelter was uncertain. Water was down to less than half a liter. He should have kept moving. Instead he turned toward the signal and followed it into a maze of fractured plating and half-buried support beams from what had once been a relay station. That was where he saw her. Blue-green skin under a film of dust. A command mantle torn at the shoulder. One leg pinned beneath a slab of collapsed alloy ribbing. She had a compact blade in her hand, though the angle told Ethan she could barely lift it. Her eyes found him through the drifting grit, bright and hard and very much awake. Not fear first. Contempt first. That almost made him smile. Do not come closer, human, she said, the translator in his collar taking half a beat to catch up with her language and turn it into English. Her voice was rough with pain but steady enough to carry rank. Ethan remained where he was, 3 yards away, and took in the details the way training had taught him to do before emotion could get involved. Breathing shallow but regular. No visible chest compromise. Blood loss controlled badly, not catastrophically. Shock coming on. Storm front building fast. Structural piece too heavy to lift clean without leverage. You can keep the knife, he said. I am more interested in whether your airway is clear. Her expression shifted by 1 degree, enough to show she had not expected that answer. You think concern will make me speak? No, Ethan said. I think if you stop breathing we both lose the argument. He reached up slowly, unclipped his rifle, and set it on the red dust where she could see every inch of the motion. Then he lowered himself to one knee. The ground was still warm from the day, heat rising through the fabric at his kneecap, but the wind had changed and carried that electric edge that always came before the sky turned hostile. His scanner ticked down the minutes in silent icons. She watched the rifle, then him, as if trying to decide which was more dangerous. Why would you do that? She asked. Ethan opened the side pouch on his med pack and pulled out a collapsible brace bar, 2 seal patches, and a compact injector. Because the storm is about 6 minutes out, he said. Because that beam is crushing circulation to your leg. And because leaving you here would be easier, but I have never trusted easy very much. For the first time, something in her gaze changed. Not trust. Not even close. But the certainty cracked. And on a battlefield where everyone had already chosen what everyone else was, that crack was the first honest thing either of them had been given all day. The storm announced itself in the language of machines before it ever touched skin. Ethan heard it in the nervous click of his suit relay, in the thin warble crawling through his earpiece, in the way the cracked edge of his visor stuttered from amber to white and back again. Static rolled over the broken relay station like surf over rock, carrying dust so fine it turned the air into a reddish haze. He could already feel the pressure change pressing against his eardrums. 5 minutes now, maybe less. He slid the collapsible brace bar from his med kit and studied the beam pinning Saren's leg. It had twisted on impact, one end buried in powder, the other caught beneath a slab of fractured wall. Too heavy to lift directly. Too unstable to cut loose. He would need leverage and timing was the one thing the sky was charging interest on. I am going to move that support, he said, keeping his voice even. When I do, the pressure is going to hit all at once. I need you to stay with me. Saren's grip tightened on the blade, though her arm trembled with the effort. You speak as if I have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Ethan said. He wedged the brace bar under the twisted alloy and planted one boot against a half-buried strut. Red grit slid under the sole. He adjusted, set his shoulder, and looked at her again. Yours is whether you fight me or help me. Her eyes narrowed, bright as cut glass through the dust. For 1 second he thought she might tell him to leave, or lie, or die annoyed. Instead she drew one shallow breath and said, "Tell me when." That was good enough. Ethan shifted his weight and leaned into the bar. Metal answered with a low, ugly groan that traveled up his arms into his teeth. Warning icons flashed across his visor. The support lifted maybe an inch, then settled again. Not enough. He backed off, breath fogging the inside edge of his helmet seal, and scanned the wreckage. A broken antenna mast lay 3 feet away, narrow enough to carry, solid enough to use as an extension. He dragged it over, ignoring the pull in his knee, locked it against the brace bar, and tried again. This time the support rose higher, slow and reluctant, as if the station itself resented being asked for mercy. "Now," Ethan said through clenched teeth. Saren swallowed a sound that might have become a cry and pulled hard with both hands, dragging her trapped leg free just as the beam slammed back into the dirt with a thud he felt through the soles of his boots. Dust burst upward in a hot red cloud. Ethan dropped to both knees beside her before it settled. "Do not touch it," she said sharply when he reached for her leg. "I know," he answered. "I am looking." The lower part of the limb was bruised and swelling beneath torn uniform fabric, but aligned. No obvious break. Circulation compromised, not lost. He pressed 2 fingers near the ankle, watched color return slowly, then snapped open a seal patch and laid it over the worst of the torn material to keep grit out. Saren watched every movement as if cataloging a species contradiction, one careful detail at a time. "You carry battlefield training," she said, her voice thinner now, more tired than cold. "Combat medic," Ethan replied. He pulled the injector from the kit and held it up where she could see. "Pain control. Low dose. It will not fog your head much. You expect me to trust a needle from a human?" Ethan almost laughed, but the wind swallowed the sound before it could become one. "No," he said. "I expect the storm to get here before pride does us any favors." For the first time since he found her, something like reluctant amusement touched one corner of her mouth, gone almost before it appeared. She gave a single, exhausted nod. Ethan pressed the injector to the side of her leg and watched the dose clear. Above them, the first arc of blue-white static crawled across the darkening sky, bright enough to turn the dust silver for half a heartbeat. Shelter had just gone from maybe to now. The first real wave of the storm hit with a sound like 1,000 radio stations dying at once. Blue-white threads of static stitched themselves across the dark sky, and the hair at the back of Ethan's neck prickled even through the suit lining. Dust lifted in twisting sheets, turning the broken relay yard into a blurred red ghost of itself. He slung his med pack higher, grabbed his rifle from the ground, and clipped it across his back without aiming it once in Saren's direction. "Can you stand if I brace you?" he asked. She tested her leg with a careful shift and immediately drew in a tight breath through her teeth. "For a few steps," she said. "After that, I will become an inconvenience." Ethan moved to her side and offered his arm, palm open, giving her the choice instead of taking it. For half a second she stared at his hand as if it belonged to some theory she had argued against in a classroom years ago. Then, with the dignity of someone accepting aid only because the universe had left her no graceful alternative, she took it. Her grip was colder than he expected. Together they rose into a world that had gone nearly sideways with wind. Ethan's boots dug deep into the powder while Saren leaned hard enough against him that he could feel the strain running through her frame each time the injured leg touched down. The storm turned the air metallic and bitter on his tongue. His visor flickered again, map overlay scrambling, then clearing just long enough to catch a structural mark 10 yards ahead and to the left. "There," he said, raising his voice over the static. "Maintenance access. If the roof held, it will give us 10 minutes, maybe 20. You assign hope in very specific measurements," Saren said, her voice thin under the rising howl. "Occupational habit," Ethan replied. "Also a coping mechanism." The hatch was half buried beneath drifted dust and a fallen panel, but the locking wool still showed a faint strip of emergency phosphor through the grit. Ethan set Saren against the wall, ignoring the protest from his knee, and dropped to both hands to clear the obstruction. Fine red powder packed under his gloves and into the seams of the hatch like it had been waiting years for a reason not to let go. Static cracked overhead hard enough to make the metal ring beneath his fingers. Behind him, Saren spoke with sudden sharpness. "Human. Ethan turned. She had pushed herself upright from the wall and was pointing past him with the compact blade still in hand. Not at him this time. At a fractured support arm shifting above the hatch under the vibration of the storm. Ethan saw it just as it slipped another inch. He lunged aside, caught the edge of the fallen panel, and used its weight to pin the support long enough to wrench the hatch will free. The seal broke with a hiss of stale air. "Inside," he said. Saren did not argue. He guided her down the narrow ladder first, one careful rung at a time, then followed and dogged the hatch shut above them. The noise of the storm dulled at once from apocalypse to thunder behind walls. The chamber below was small, maybe 8 feet by 12, lined with dead control boxes and old maintenance lockers filmed with dust. Emergency strips along the ceiling glowed a weak amber, enough to turn Saren's blue-green skin into the color of deep ocean under sunset. Ethan lowered himself onto an overturned storage crate and finally let out the breath he had been carrying for what felt like an hour. His suit display blinked low reserve warnings in patient, accusing light. Across from him, Saren sat with her back against the wall, studying him in that same unsettling way she had since the field, as if every answer only led to a more inconvenient question. "You had time to save yourself," she said at last. "You keep observing that," Ethan answered. "Because you keep refusing to behave correctly," she said. There was no insult in it now. Only honest confusion. Ethan pulled a thermal wrap from his pack, shook the dust off, and placed it beside her instead of over his own shoulders. The chamber was already cooling, old metal giving up the day's heat inch by inch. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I have been told that before." Saren looked at the wrap, then at him, and something in her expression shifted again, small as a change in light, but real. Not trust yet. Not gratitude either. Just the first fragile suggestion that the stories she had been taught about men like Ethan Cole were beginning to run out of room. The chamber settled into a strange kind of silence once the first fury of the storm moved fully overhead. It was not true quiet. The old maintenance walls ticked as metal cooled, and somewhere behind the left panel a dying capacitor gave off a faint, uneven hum like an insect trapped inside the machinery. Dust drifted in the weak amber light, turning slow circles in the stale air. Ethan pulled off his helmet and set it beside his boot. Coolness touched the sweat at his temples at once, and the inside of the room smelled like old wiring, dry stone, and the sharp medicinal trace of the injector he had used on Saren's leg. He ran one hand through hair flattened by the helmet seal and checked the charge on his wrist display. 9% now. Good enough to worry about later. Across from him, Saren had wrapped the thermal sheet around her shoulders, though she wore it with the rigid dignity of someone pretending comfort was a strategic decision. Her blade still rested in her hand, but the point now angled toward the floor instead of his chest. Progress, Ethan supposed, came in odd little measurements. He opened a side pocket on the med pack and took out a water tube. "Sip, not too much," he said, holding it out. "You lost fluids." She looked at the tube, then at him. "You continue to give away resources you cannot spare." That is one interpretation. What is the other? Ethan shrugged. "I am investing in the possibility that neither of us dies annoyed." For the second time that day, the corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. She accepted the tube and took a careful drink, watching him over the rim as if humor itself had complicated the file she was building on him. "Your people do this often?" she asked. "Make jokes in ruins." "We make jokes in hospitals, evacuation lines, funerals, and tax offices," Ethan said. "It is one of our more confusing survival instincts." Saren lowered the tube. The weak light caught the fine shimmer in her skin where red dust had not fully brushed away, and for a moment she looked less like an officer and more like someone simply exhausted. "We were taught that humans laugh when they are close to cruelty," she said. Ethan leaned back against the wall and felt the cold of the metal through his suit. "Sometimes we laugh because we are scared," he said. "Sometimes because we are tired. Sometimes because the alternative is yelling at the sky, and the sky never improves. She studied him in silence for a few beats. Outside, static rolled over the hatch with a low electric growl. On my world, Saren said at last, children learn Terran engine signatures before they learn trade dialects. We memorize emergency shelter routes in primary school. We are shown recordings of your soldiers advancing through smoke and alarms. We are told that humans do not stop. That if they reach your door, the kindest thing you can hope for is speed. Ethan let her words hang there. He did not rush to defend his species. Some histories were too heavy for quick answers. And what are humans told about yours? She asked. That your command structure is clean and efficient, he said. That your ships are faster in atmosphere. That your officers do not bluff often. That if one of you calls something a necessary loss, you usually mean it. Saren's gaze sharpened. That is a military answer. It is the safest kind. And the honest kind? Ethan looked down at his hands, at the dust caught in the lines of his knuckles, at the small crescent scar near his thumb from a field kit latch years ago. The honest kind is that most people get taught each other through sirens first, he said quietly. After enough years, fear starts dressing itself up as wisdom. Saren went very still. The blade in her hand lowered another inch. The storm boomed overhead, but inside the chamber something subtler shifted, almost too small to name. Not surrender. Not peace. Just the first real conversation two enemies had allowed themselves to have without uniforms doing all the speaking for them. When the storm finally began to move east, it did not end so much as loosen its grip. The screaming static faded to a rough hiss above the hatch, and the amber emergency strips along the maintenance chamber ceiling steadied from a nervous flicker into a tired, constant glow. Ethan checked the time stamp on his wrist display and frowned. 43 minutes lost underground. On a normal day that would have meant inconvenience. On a battlefield with broken command lines and damaged sensors, it meant the map outside might as well have been a rumor. He pulled his helmet back on, sealed it with a soft click, and listened. To the chamber filled with the filtered sound of his own breathing. Across from him, Saren tightened the thermal wrap around her shoulders and pushed herself upright against the wall with more stubbornness than strength. Tell me the truth, she said. How far can I walk before I become dead weight? Ethan crouched beside her and checked the support wrap on her leg, fingers moving carefully over the fasteners. The swelling had held where it was. Not good, not worse. He would take stable as a personal favor from the universe. A quarter mile if you are determined, he said. Half if you are angry. Saren lifted one brow. And if I am both? Then we get ambitious. He opened the hatch a few inches first, letting the dust settle through the gap before he pushed it the rest of the way. Cold air slid down the ladder, dry and metallic, carrying the faint burn smell of overloaded circuitry from somewhere above. Ethan climbed out first and offered a hand down. This time Saren took it without staring at it first. Outside, the relay yard looked scraped clean by the storm. The drifts had shifted. Debris that had been half buried now stood exposed like bones under red moonlight. Far off to the west, lightning still moved inside the clouds in silent blue pulses. Ethan helped Saren to a narrow path between fractured panels and listened for anything that did not belong to wind. At first there was nothing. Then, faint and intermittent, a metallic tapping from somewhere beyond a collapsed signal mast. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Not random. Not weather. Ethan raised one hand for silence and turned his head toward the sound. Saren's eyes sharpened instantly. A code? She asked. Maybe, Ethan said. Maybe someone trying very hard not to be noticed. He guided her behind the angled shell of a broken transport cowling and moved ahead alone, slow enough not to trigger panic, careful where he placed each boot. The tapping stopped when he was still 10 feet away. For a moment all he saw was dust, torn conduit, and the silver edge of a snapped comm dish. Then a small figure rose from the shadow between two plates, no taller than Ethan's shoulder, wrapped in a scout mantle several sizes too big. Young. Barely more than a teenager by the look of him. Thin hands. Shaking around an ion sidearm pointed in completely the wrong direction for confidence. The kid's skin was the same sea-glass blue as many of the tribunal judges, but dulled now by fear and dust. "Stay back, human," he said, and the translator on Ethan's collar turned the words into English with a tremor it had not added on its own. Ethan stopped immediately and let both hands hang open where they could be seen. "Easy," he said. "I am not here to rush you. You are armed. So are you." The young scout swallowed. The weapon wavered. "You will take my transmitter." "No," Ethan said. "I am going to ask if you are hurt." The boy blinked like the sentence had arrived in the wrong language. Behind Ethan, Saren stepped into view, leaning on the wall for support. Recognition flashed across the scout's face so hard it almost looked like pain. "Commander Vale." "Stand down, Talon," she said, her voice not loud but carrying rank even through exhaustion. "If this human wished us harm, we would not still be speaking." Talon looked from her to Ethan and back again, every lesson he had ever been taught fighting for space behind his eyes. Ethan could almost see it happening. The shape of fear. The expectation of force. The readiness to be proven right. Instead, Ethan unclipped the spare water tube from his belt and set it on the plating between them. Then he stepped back. "Keep the transmitter," he said. "Keep the sidearm too. We are just trying to get out of here alive." The boy stared at the water like it had insulted his understanding of the world. And in that quiet, under the broken skeleton of a battlefield, Ethan watched another story begin to crack. Talon did not lower the sidearm right away, but the angle changed. It shifted from Ethan's center mass to the empty space near his shoulder, the kind of correction a frightened person made when fear began losing ground to thought. His eyes stayed fixed on the water tube lying between them, on the plain human gesture of leaving something useful within reach and then stepping back from it. The wind moved dust through the broken relay yard in thin red streamers, and somewhere overhead a loose panel tapped against a twisted frame with a hollow metallic knock that sounded too much like a failing heartbeat. Saren eased herself down against the transport cowling and pressed one hand to her injured leg. Ethan could hear the strain in her breathing even through his helmet filters. He wanted all of them moving, but rushing frightened people was how mistakes got dressed up as urgency. "Your transmitter," he said to Talon, keeping his voice low and level. "Does it still reach anyone?" The young scout hesitated, then crouched just enough to snatch up the water with his free hand, as if accepting kindness at all required speed before pride could stop him. He took one swallow, winced at the dryness in his throat, and finally nodded. "Short range only. Storm damage took the directional array." "Any response?" Ethan asked. "Fragments." Talon looked toward Saren, not Ethan, when he answered. "Civilian emergency ping 2 miles east of here. Underground. Repeating every 4 minutes." I could not confirm if it was current or cached. Saren's expression sharpened at once. "A shelter?" "That was my assumption, Commander." Ethan felt the words settle into him with the hard weight of responsibility. "Civilian beacon. Underground. 2 miles east across terrain all 3 of them would struggle to cross, especially with 1 injured officer and 1 barely grown scout carrying too much fear for his age." His display blinked 8% battery in the lower corner like a small, patient threat. "Why did you not go there?" Ethan asked. Talon's jaw tightened. "Because I saw you first." There it was. Honest and simple. Ethan looked away for a second, out across the relay yard where the storm had stripped everything down to exposed edges and silence. He could not even blame the kid. A young scout alone in a collapsed sector had seen a human soldier walking through dust with a rifle and decided distance was wisdom. That was not paranoia. That was training reinforced by history. Saren must have read the same thing in Ethan's stillness, because her voice softened by half a degree when she spoke. He chose survival, she said. That is not shameful. Talon looked between them with open confusion now, as if he had expected accusation and had been handed mercy twice in under 5 minutes. Ethan crouched near the snapped comm dish and pulled a compact scanner from his belt. The screen rolled static for a moment, then resolved into weak contour lines and one intermittent pulse. To the east. Faint, but real. He exhaled through his nose. It is there, he said. Not strong, but live. Talon's grip on the sidearm loosened another fraction. Then we move now. Ethan glanced at Saren's leg, then at the slope of debris waiting between them and the signal. We move smart, he corrected. He opened his med pack again and took out the last support wrap, a strip of flexible brace material lined with seal threads. He knelt in front of Saren and held it up for her to see. This will help you keep weight off the joint. It is all I have left for mobility support. Saren looked at the wrap, then at his nearly empty kit, understanding arriving before the words. And if you need it later? Then I make a worse decision later, Ethan said. Talon stared at him outright now, all pretense gone. You would spend your last field support on an enemy officer. Ethan fastened the brace carefully around Saren's leg, fingers steady despite the cold creeping into them. I would spend it on the person who needs to walk, he said. The words fell into the ruined air with no drama at all, which somehow made them heavier. When he finished, Saren rose slowly, tested the support, and found that it held. Her eyes lifted to his faceplate, and whatever she had been taught about humans all her life, Ethan saw another piece of it break and fall away in the silence. 2 miles, he said, standing and slinging the lighter, sat her med pack over one shoulder. Stay low. Stay quiet. And if we find that shelter full of civilians, then for the next hour nobody here is Terran or Concord. Talon lowered the sidearm completely. What are we then? Ethan checked the eastern pulse one more time and started walking. Alive, he said. Let us try to keep it that way. The eastern route was worse than Ethan had hoped and better than he feared, which on a battlefield counted as luck. The storm had flattened most of the loose dust into rippled sheets that crunched faintly beneath their boots, but it had also exposed long ribs of broken metal and pockets of unstable ground where old service trenches had caved in beneath the relay district. Ethan kept the scanner in his left hand and his rifle secured across his back. Not out of trust in the world but out of discipline. Every few seconds the weak pulse from the civilian beacon blinked across the screen and vanished again, like a heartbeat trying to survive under too much weight. Saren moved on his right with the brace holding well enough to keep her pace steady, though each step still cost her something she refused to name. Talon ranged a few yards ahead, transmitter clipped to his shoulder, head turning at every scrape of wind against metal. He had stopped looking at Ethan like a loaded question. Now he looked at him the way soldiers sometimes looked at terrain they had been warned about but had never crossed before, cautious, focused, unwilling to make a mistake. The sky above them had cleared into a hard black dome cut by thin streaks of electric blue where the last of the storm still muttered beyond the horizon. Moonlight touched the wreckage in silver lines. Nothing moved for nearly 20 minutes except dust and 3 tired figures trying not to sound like targets. Then Ethan's scanner flashed a broad motion bloom at the edge of its range. Not one source. Several. He lifted a fist and the other 2 stopped instantly. Off to the south, shapes passed between fractured walls and snapped antennae, too far to identify cleanly but moving with the rhythm of a sweep pattern. Search teams, maybe salvage crews, maybe something worse. On this planet, categories had a bad habit of changing after first contact. Talon's hand went back to his sidearm. They are heading across our path, he whispered. Saren's jaw tightened. If they scan us, they will not ask for nuance. Ethan checked the beacon again. Still east. Still live. He studied the terrain and saw it a second later, a drainage channel half collapsed beneath a stretch of exposed conduit, narrow but continuous, running almost exactly where they needed to go. "Down there," he said. "Single file. Keep your profiles low and your gear quiet." Talon looked into the trench and frowned. "That conduit has not been serviced in years." "Then let us honor tradition and be disappointed by infrastructure later," Ethan murmured. Even Saren gave him the briefest glance of disbelief at the timing of the joke, but she followed him down into the channel without argument. The trench smelled of cold rust and mineral damp, a surprising scent in a place so otherwise dry. Metal overhead clicked softly as it cooled. They moved bent at the waist beneath the conduit, boots slipping on old maintenance grit, while the distant figures crossed somewhere above and beyond them. No one spoke for several long minutes. Ethan could hear only filtered breathing, the faint buzz from Talon's damaged transmitter, and the small involuntary catch in Saren's breath whenever the trench forced her injured leg into a bad angle. Halfway through the channel, the beacon pulse strengthened. Ethan stopped so fast Talon nearly walked into him. There, beneath a slope of broken concrete and relay stone, half hidden by a curtain of storm-torn mesh, was a recessed access door lit by one stubborn green emergency strip. Human lettering had worn off long ago, but the universal civil shelter symbol was still visible under the dust. Talon stared at it as if he had expected hope to look more dramatic. Saren placed one hand on the wall to steady herself and let out a slow breath that shook on the way out. Ethan walked to the door and pressed his palm against the access plate. Cold. Powered, but barely. He could feel the vibration of old systems still trying. Then, from somewhere behind the metal, came the faint sound of movement. Small movement. More than one person. Someone was alive in there. Ethan looked back at Saren and Talon, at the fear still in them, at the exhaustion, at the thing changing shape between all three of them one choice at a time. Then he reached for the manual release and said very softly, "Whatever is waiting on the other side, we go in as helpers first." The manual release fought him for a second, then gave with a grinding shudder that sent a tremor through the old frame. The shelter door opened only 8 inches before catching on warped tracks, but that was enough for a wash of stale, warm air to slip out into the cold night. It carried the sense of too many people in too little space, recycled breath, antiseptic, overheated circuitry, damp fabric, fear. Ethan angled his flashlight through the gap and kept the beam low, away from faces. The room beyond was deeper than he expected, a reinforced civil shelter with rows of fold-down benches, emergency storage bins, and a bank of dead monitors along the rear wall. At least 24 civilians looked back at him from the amber gloom. Mothers clutching children. Elderly men wrapped in thermal sheets. Teenagers trying very hard to stand like they were not afraid. Most were concord by dress and features, but a few wore mixed work gear from freight crews and maintenance guilds, the kind of people war usually remembered last. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then a little girl with silver markings along her temples buried her face in the side of the woman next to her and whispered something Ethan did not need a translator to understand. Human. The word moved through the shelter in small, frightened ripples. Ethan took one step back from the door on purpose. "Easy," he said, pitching his voice low and steady so it would carry without sounding like command. "Nobody is here to clear you out. We picked up your emergency ping." Behind him, Saren shifted into the light just enough for the people inside to see her command mantle and the brace on her leg. The reaction changed at once, fear turning from raw panic into something strained but listening. A gray-haired elder rose from a bench near the center, one hand pressed to the side of a portable oxygen unit. "Commander Vale," he said, disbelief roughening the edges of the title. "We were told all sectors east had fallen." "Most did," Saren answered. "This shelter did not." Ethan crouched near the threshold and scanned the interior with a medic's eye, letting detail build the truth faster than anyone's pride could. One damaged air recycler. Water stores low. 3 visible fevers. A child with a splinted wrist. An older woman favoring one side with every breath. No sign of immediate collapse, but the kind of slow decline that killed by accumulation if nobody interrupted it. Talon moved to the doorway beside Ethan, his transmitter already in hand. For the first time since the relay yard, he did not look at Ethan for permission. He looked at the room and saw people. Their secondary power cell is failing, he said after checking the panel by the door. Life support will hold for maybe 2 more hours before the air cycling drops below safe margin. Ethan's gaze snapped to the dead monitor bank on the far wall and then to the battered maintenance ports beneath it. There it was. The real danger. Not the cold. Not the dark. The timetable. He rose and ducked through the gap into the shelter, moving slowly enough that every frightened eye could track him. I need the maintenance schematics, he said. Anything printed, anything cached, anything at all. A young woman in a freight jacket stared at him. You know these systems? Enough to make bad guesses with confidence, Ethan said. Tonight that might be useful. The line was dry, but it did what he meant it to do. Shoulders lowered by an inch. A child stopped crying just long enough to look at him instead of hiding. Saren came in after him, one careful step at a time, and the room made space for her without being asked. Ethan dropped his med pack beside the nearest bench and opened it. Not much left. Seal patches. 1 fever strip. A half tube of hydration gel. The usual field arithmetic of too little and still not nothing. He looked up at the civilians watching him and felt the old weight settle into place inside his chest, familiar as pulse. Outside, patrols were sweeping the sector. His battery was nearly gone. Extraction was a fantasy. None of that changed the immediate math. People in front of him needed help. That was enough to build the next decision on. All right, he said, rolling up his sleeves as if this were just another ugly shift in another failing place. Let us see how stubborn this shelter wants to be. The shelter wanted to fail in 100 small, stubborn ways at once. Ethan knelt beside the maintenance ports under the dead monitor bank and pulled the scorched access cover free with the edge of a field tool, releasing a breath of trapped heat that smelled like burnt dust and tired copper. Inside, the wiring was a mess of patched circuits, improvised couplings, and one badly seated relay crystal that had probably been vibrating loose for weeks before the storm ever arrived. He had seen this kind of system desperation before on colony outposts and medical barges, places kept alive by people who did not have replacement parts but refused to surrender to that fact. Talon crouched beside him with the printed schematics he had found in a cracked emergency bin, holding the pages flat with both hands while the old shelter fans rattled overhead. The recycler. Routes through this junction, the scout said, tracing a narrow line with one finger. If the relay drops completely, the filtration cycle will stall. Not if we bully it first, Ethan muttered. He reseated the crystal, stripped back one frayed lead, and bridged the gap with a seal thread from his med kit, twisting the conductive fibers into place with slow, careful pressure. It was a ridiculous use for medical supplies. It was also the only conductive thread in the room. Behind him, Saren had taken over the shelter the way only real officers could, not with noise but with gravity. She had civilians rotating water rations, children moved away from the coldest wall, and the elderly settled closest to the strongest heat vents. Even injured, she made frightened people feel less like a crowd and more like a unit that could survive the next hour. Ethan noticed it without looking directly at her. He also noticed the little girl from the doorway sitting on a bench now, silver markings bright against her temples, watching his hands work with solemn concentration usually reserved for priests and mechanics. Try the panel, Ethan said. Talon reached up and slapped the reset switch. For one awful second nothing happened. Then the nearest ceiling vent coughed, wheezed, and began to turn with a low, uneven hum. Air moved through the shelter again, thin but real. A ripple of relieved sound passed through the room, soft enough to break Ethan's heart faster than shouting ever could. The old elder with the oxygen unit closed his eyes and pressed one shaking hand to his chest. Ethan let out a breath and sat back on his heels. "That buys you time," he said. "Not comfort. Do not confuse those." "You speak like every engineer I have ever hated," Saren said from across the room. Ethan glanced up. She was leaning against a storage locker, pale with fatigue but standing anyway. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me this week," he replied. A few people actually smiled, brief and tired and almost disbelieving. Then Talon's damaged transmitter crackled to life so sharply the whole shelter stiffened. Static tore across the speaker, followed by fragmented command traffic rendered into ugly pieces by storm interference. Ethan caught only enough to understand the danger. Sweep coordinates. Sector grid. Structural purge authorization. The Eastern Relay District had been marked for clearance at dawn to prevent reoccupation and secondary collapse. This shelter, hidden beneath old relay stone and bad maps, was sitting squarely inside the designated zone. Silence dropped over the room with frightening speed. No one asked Ethan what that meant. They could hear it in his stillness. He rose slowly and took the transmitter from Talon, turning the dial until the signal sharpened just enough to wound with clarity. The order repeated. Dawn. Clearance. No civilian confirmation. No exceptions noted. Ethan looked at the failing lights, the patched recycler, the children, the old man with the oxygen line, Saren bracing herself on a locker because sitting down might make standing again impossible. He felt the world narrow to the size of one decision. "Can you answer on Concord command bands?" he asked Talon. "Only if I boost through the shelter repeater, and that will expose the beacon to every scanner within 10 miles. Ethan nodded once. That was what he had expected. The safe choices were gone now. All that remained were the costly ones. He handed the transmitter back and looked toward the sealed door as if he could already see the black horizon beyond it turning pale. "Then we do not hide," he said quietly. "We make them see us." For half a second nobody in the shelter moved, as if the room itself had forgotten how. Then sound returned in pieces, a child asking a question too softly to hear, the recycler coughing overhead, the dry crackle of Talon's transmitter still bleeding static into the air. Saren pushed off the locker and came toward Ethan with the careful, rigid gait of someone ignoring pain on principle. "If we light the repeater, every patrol in range will lock on this position," she said. "And if we do nothing, dawn turns this place into a cautionary note in someone else's report," Ethan answered. He was already moving, pulling the flashlight from his belt, checking the charge on his suit, calculating angles and distance with the exhausted clarity that came when all the smaller options had burned away. Battery reserve 7%. Enough for a beacon burst if he stripped everything else down to bare function. Maybe. "There is an old relay mast above us," Talon said suddenly, pages of the schematics trembling in his hands. "Not the main tower. A service spine. Manual access from the drainage channel. If the repeater still has line of sight, someone on the surface could hard route an emergency code through it." Ethan looked at him. "Someone visible." Talon swallowed. "Yes." Saren understood before the rest of the room did. Ethan saw it in the way her expression went still, not shocked, just deeply unwilling. "No," she said. It was the first time she had used the word on him without rank or distrust behind it. Just refusal. Ethan gave her a tired half-smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am open to a better bad idea." She held his gaze for one long second, and in that second everything complicated and unfinished between them seemed to narrow into one unbearable fact: she knew he was right. The little girl on the bench was still watching him. So was the old man with the oxygen line. So was every civilian in the shelter who had spent the night trying to believe survival had not already passed them by. Ethan crouched in front of Talon and unclipped the emergency transponder from his own harness. The casing was scratched, the Terran insignia half worn smooth, but the red medical sigil still glowed when he pressed the test stud. "When I reach the mast, You boost this through the shelter repeater and every open band your transmitter can still bully into cooperation, he said. Civilian emergency. Medical priority. Structural clearance conflict. Repeat until somebody with authority gets tired of hearing me. Talon stared at the transponder as if it weighed more than metal should. They may target the signal. That is the point, Ethan said. I need them looking at me instead of guessing what is under their feet. Saren stepped closer. The amber shelter light caught the dust still clinging to the edges of her blue-green skin and the fine strain around her eyes. You cannot outrun a sweep team on 7% power, she said quietly. Was not planning on outrunning anybody. Ethan reached up and, before thinking too hard about it, adjusted the edge of her slipping thermal wrap where it had caught under the command mantle. A small gesture. Human. Ridiculously human. Her breath caught almost too softly to hear. Then what are you planning? She asked. Ethan glanced toward the sealed shelter door, where Cold waited on the other side with the coming dawn. To stand where they can see the signal and have to choose whether they are clearing a ruin or silencing a rescue call. He rose, slung the rifle off his back, and leaned it against the wall beside the maintenance port. The motion rippled through the shelter harder than any speech could have. An armed human going into danger was one story. An unarmed one carrying only a beacon was another entirely. Talon looked from the rifle to Ethan and seemed younger all at once. Why leave it? Ethan flexed his empty hands once, as if reminding them what they were for. Because I am not going up there to threaten anyone. The room fell silent again, but not with fear this time. With recognition. Saren reached for the transponder in Talon's hands, closed his fingers around it, and said, with all the force of command and all the weight of witness, then we make certain the entire sky knows exactly what kind of human is standing above this shelter. Dawn came to the relay district without warmth. It arrived as a thin silver seam along the horizon, turning the broken metal around the shelter into cold lines and pale edges. Ethan climbed the service spine alone with the emergency transponder clipped to his chest and one gloved hand on the frost-cold rungs. Every pull of his arms sent a dull protest through his shoulders, and his suit display had already stripped itself down to the essentials: battery reserve, pulse, beacon readiness. 6%. The wind had changed again, cleaner now after the storm, carrying the mineral scent of wet stone and scorched circuitry across the open ground. When he reached the platform near the top of the mast, the entire eastern sector opened around him in silence. Wreckage fields. Collapsed walls. Long red scars in the earth. And somewhere beneath one broken piece of that landscape, a room full of civilians waiting for the sky to decide whether they counted. Ethan locked the transponder into the relay socket, twisted the manual override, and watched the medical sigil bloom bright red against the gray dawn. The signal climbed at once, a clean vertical pulse visible even to the naked eye, cutting into the morning like a promise too stubborn to die quietly. A second later Talon found the repeater link below, and the transponder began broadcasting on every channel still willing to listen. Civilian. Emergency. Medical priority. Structural clearance conflict. Confirm survivors on site. Civilian emergency. Medical priority. Ethan took 2 steps back from the mast and raised both empty hands where any scope or scanner could read them clearly. No rifle. No cover. Just a human standing beside a rescue beacon in the open. He could hear engines then, distant at first and growing, one signature from the west, another from high altitude to the south. Sweep teams. Command craft. Witnesses. Good. Let them all come. He kept his hands visible and his body square to the sky. Below him, the shelter door had opened by a careful inch. Saren stood there in the shadow of the entrance with the thermal wrap around her shoulders and the command mantle beneath it, one hand braced against the frame, eyes fixed on him with a look so steady it felt like being held upright from a distance. Ethan could not hear her from the mast, but he did not need to. He knew that look now. It was the look of someone watching the last piece of an old belief fall away. The first patrol craft broke through the low cloud bank and slowed as it caught the red medical pulse. Another followed, then another, their searchlights sweeping the ruins before stopping on Ethan himself. He did not move. The open broadcast continued. Civilian emergency. Medical priority. Confirm survivors on site. The second stretched. In war, seconds could become entire moral histories. Then one of the patrol lights shifted away from Ethan and lowered toward the shelter entrance. Another did the same. No firing solution. No clearance strike. Just recognition at last, cold and official and late, but recognition all the same. Ethan let out a breath he had been holding since the shelter door first opened beneath his hand. 2 rescue skiffs descended after that, their markings Concord blue and Terran white side by side, called in by procedure, by pressure, by shame, maybe by all 3. Medics poured out with stretchers and field packs, and the civilians began to emerge into the morning, blinking against the light like people surfacing from a long, bad dream. The little girl with silver markings was one of the first. She looked up at Ethan where he still stood by the beacon and lifted one small hand in a gesture too simple to be ceremonial and too sincere to be anything else. Hours later, beneath the white beams of the tribunal chamber, Saren Vale finished her testimony with that same dawn still living somewhere behind her eyes. You asked what we learned from the human on that field, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room with no need of force. We learned that power is common in war. Fear is common. Even violence, sadly, is common. What is rare is restraint when no one would punish cruelty. What is rare is mercy when hatred would be easier to justify. He stood in the open, unarmed, so our children could remain hidden 1 minute longer and then walk out into daylight alive. That is the fact before this tribunal. No one spoke after that. The chamber did not need sound. Ethan stood with the restraint cuff still on his wrists and watched as one judge after another lowered their gaze, not in submission to a human, but in respect for a choice none of them could pretend not to understand.